The hospital runs on bright lights and clean floors, but at night it becomes a maze of empty hallways and locked doors that don't stay locked. Sarah sits alone in the break room, watching the city glow through a small window, counting the minutes of her first night shift. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, the corridors stretch out like tunnels, and every footstep sounds too loud. Then something changes, soft movement in the distance, a sound behind her, and a whisper sliding out of the dark. It doesn't call for help. It doesn't call for anyone else. It calls her name. The night had fallen silent, almost too silent for Sarah's liking. She sat in the break room of the hospital, staring out the small window that framed the city skyline, a blur of lights and shadows. It was her first night shift, her very first shift in a place that felt more like a tomb than a hospital. At this hour, the hum of the world outside seemed distant, almost like a memory, while the corridors of the hospital were left to themselves. The faint buzzing of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound that filled the emptiness. Sarah checked the clock on the wall. 10:30 p.m. She still had hours to go. The thought of the empty halls stretching out before her, full of unknowns, made her stomach tighten. She'd heard the stories everyone who worked the night shift had. The whispers, the strange happenings, the inexplicable occurrences that nobody ever fully explained. Most of the staff who worked these hours were too busy to think much of it, chalking it up to tiredness or imagination. But Sarah was new here, and this place, this hospital, had a history that sent chills down her spine. Her colleagues, those who had worked the graveyard shifts for years, told her to keep her head down, do her job, and not get too caught up in the stories. But tonight, something felt different. The hospital, which had once been a bustling hub during the day, was now eerily quiet, as though it had lost its pulse. She stood up and stretched, shaking off the unease that clung to her. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. There was no room for fear here. She was a professional, and professionals didn't get freaked out by empty halls and the whispers of others. With a deep breath, Sarah gathered her things, shoved her phone into her pocket, and stepped into the hallway. The overhead lights flickered for a moment before steadying, casting a cold, sterile glow on the otherwise dark corridor. The sterile white walls seemed to press in on her as she walked down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps reverberating louder than usual in the quiet. The hospital had a distinct smell, antiseptic, mixed with a faint odor of something older. The kind of smell that clung to the air long after the place had been scrubbed and cleaned. She passed an old nurse's station, its lights dimmed. No one was around, as expected. This late at night, the hospital had only a few staff members on hand. She checked her watch again, wondering if the night would ever end. Her first few hours had been uneventful. The occasional patient in a room here or there, a few rounds of medication. The usual. But now, as she walked deeper into the building, there was an unsettling silence. Even the usual hum of machines seemed to have faded into the background. A sharp creak echoed from somewhere ahead, and Sarah paused, her breath catching in her throat. She turned her head, scanning the corridor. Nothing. Her heart began to race. It was just the building settling. She'd heard it before, the creaks, the groans of an old structure trying to maintain its shape under its own weight. But then came the sound again, this time closer. A faint shuffle of footsteps, soft but distinct. Sarah froze. Her breath hitched. She was certain she had heard it, yet there was no one around. The hallway stretched in front of her, empty, like a long tunnel leading nowhere. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she had imagined it. Maybe the stress of her first shift was getting to her. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her nerves. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, but she refused to let her imagination run wild. A few seconds passed in eerie silence. Then, just as she was about to move forward, a low, raspy whisper seemed to float from the direction of the nurse's station. "Sarah." Her heart skipped a beat. It was unmistakable, a voice, soft but clear, calling her name. The hospital was empty. The night shift was always dead quiet, with only a few staff members. She hadn't heard anyone walk by, hadn't seen anyone near the nurse's station. There was no one. Yet the voice, it was real. Her pulse quickened as she instinctively turned toward the sound. The hallway remained still, empty. The whisper had stopped, but the air felt charged now, as if something invisible was lingering just out of sight. Sarah strained her ears, listening for any movement, but there was nothing. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks. She was tired. It had been a long day, and the fatigue was starting to catch up with her. Still, something didn't sit right. She stood there for a few moments longer, waiting for any further sign, but the hallway remained eerily quiet. Determined not to let fear take hold, Sarah continued walking, her footsteps echoing loudly in the hollow corridor. She kept her head down, focused on her route, though her eyes kept darting to the corners, half expecting something to appear. Her hand trembled as she reached the end of the hallway and turned the corner. That's when she saw it. A patient's room door, slightly ajar. The lights inside were dimmed, and the bed was empty. But the strange part was the fact that the room was supposed to be locked. She had checked earlier, and the patient had been assigned to a different part of the hospital for the night. Yet here it was wide open. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she stepped forward, the hairs on her arms prickling. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in there watching her. Her pulse raced, and for a moment, she considered turning around and going back to the break room. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this after all. But she didn't. Instead, she pushed the door open, just a fraction more, and peeked inside. The bed was empty, but there was something off about the room. The sheets were rumpled, as though someone had been lying there not long ago. And then she saw it. On the floor, beside the bed, was a small object. It was a teddy bear, nothing too unusual in itself. Hospitals sometimes had stuffed animals for children. But this one wasn't normal. It was facing her, as if it had been placed deliberately to stare her down. Its button eyes glistened in the dim light, and Sarah felt a sudden wave of unease flood over her. Her stomach churned. She stepped inside the room and picked up the bear, inspecting it. There was nothing unusual about it, except for the intense feeling of wrongness it gave her. She set it back down on the bed and backed out of the room, her heart racing. She told herself it was just a weird coincidence, but she couldn't shake the nagging sense that something wasn't right. As she moved down the hall, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang. It sounded like a door slamming shut in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Her pulse quickened again and she looked around, but there was no one. The corridor was still empty. Was she imagining things? Or was something else happening here? Whatever it was, she wasn't sure she wanted to stick around to find out. She turned around, ready to head back to the break room, when a voice echoed through the hallway. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. Sarah. It came from behind her. Without thinking, she bolted. Her shoes slapped against the floor, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She didn't look back. Whatever it was, she knew she didn't want to find out. The sound of Sarah's panicked footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the quietness of the hospital amplifying her every move. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts as she rounded a corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't dare look back, but the feeling that something was behind her, that something was watching her, was too overwhelming to ignore. She could still hear the voice, faint but distinct, calling her name over and over again. Her mind raced. Was it real? Had someone been following her? She'd been told the hospital was nearly empty at night, but in that moment, it felt anything but. Every shadow seemed to shift, every flicker of light seemed to carry a hidden meaning. Her body was telling her to run, but her feet kept carrying her deeper into the hospital, as though something was pulling her forward. She reached the nurse's station and paused for a moment, trying to steady her breath. She pressed her hand to the cool countertop, her fingers trembling. The voice had stopped, but the air felt thick with something she couldn't quite place. A presence, perhaps, something that had been lingering in the walls long before she arrived. Get it together, she muttered to herself. She knew she couldn't keep running. She couldn't be afraid of an empty hospital, could she? She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of panic clouding her thoughts. For a brief moment, she considered going back to the break room to sit and catch her breath. Maybe, just maybe, she had imagined the whole thing. It was a new environment, and the stress of her first night shift was bound to cause her mind to play tricks on her. She was tired, and the building's creaks and groans were just a product of age and wear. Nothing more. But as she turned to head back, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. It was as if every inch of the hospital had eyes, every corner, every crevice. The walls seemed to breathe with her, drawing closer, enclosing her in a suffocating grip. The oppressive atmosphere felt like it was closing in on her, and Sarah knew in that moment that she couldn't stay here. Not tonight. Not with whatever was lurking in the shadows. Her feet moved without thinking, carrying her further down the hallway, past rooms that were too quiet, too still. As she walked, the feeling of unease intensified. She couldn't shake the strange sensation that something was wrong with this place, something more than just the tiredness of a night shift. This hospital, this building, had a history, a reputation among the night staff. Sarah had heard rumors, of course, but she had chalked them up to nothing more than superstitions, passed down from one worker to another. There were whispers about strange occurrences, people hearing footsteps when no one was around, lights flickering in empty rooms, doors opening and closing on their own. But everyone seemed to dismiss them as just that, rumors. Now, standing in the hallway, Sarah was starting to wonder if there was more truth to those stories than she had first believed. She thought back to the journal she had found earlier, the one that belonged to a nurse who had worked here years ago. The nurse had written about the strange occurrences she had witnessed, the whispers, the unexplainable sounds, the feeling of being watched even when there was no one there. The journal had stopped abruptly, with a cryptic message, "You're next." Sarah's mind kept returning to those words, the chill they had sent down her spine. She turned another corner, and suddenly she froze. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood motionless. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, but there was something distinctly wrong about it. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at her, though its face was obscured by darkness. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't someone from the hospital. No, this was something else entirely. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and run, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, her body refusing to obey the command to flee. She wanted to scream, to call out, but her voice felt stuck in her throat. The figure didn't move an inch. It didn't even seem to breathe. It was as though it was waiting for her to make the first move. The seconds felt like hours as Sarah stood there, trying to process what she was seeing. Was it a person? A shadow? Her mind couldn't wrap around the idea of a person standing there, watching her without saying a word. And yet, it didn't seem like it was human. It was too still, too lifeless. She blinked, and when her eyes opened again, the figure was gone. Her heart was racing as she looked around, her pulse thumping in her ears. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. Had she imagined it? She had to have. It was just the stress of the night, playing tricks on her. The fatigue, the loneliness. It had to be. But as she turned to leave, the feeling of being watched persisted. It was as if the eyes of the entire hospital were upon her, tracking her every move. She could hear the distant echo of footsteps again, but when she turned, there was no one behind her. "Stop it," Sarah muttered, shaking her head. She had to get a grip. She was fine. This was fine. There was no figure, no ghost, no eerie presence in the hallway. She was just tired. She was being paranoid. But as she walked down the hall, the whispers started again, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each step. She heard her name, just barely, carried on the air like a breath. It was as though the walls were speaking to her, calling her in, beckoning her forward. "Sarah." The voice whispered again, so close that she felt it brushing against her ear. She spun around, her breath catching, but the hall was empty. Nothing. No one. It was just her mind. Just the isolation, the loneliness of the night shift. Nothing more. But then came a sound that made her freeze in place. A soft, metallic clink, followed by the unmistakable creak of a door opening behind her. She whipped around, her eyes darting to the source of the noise. The door at the far end of the hallway had been slightly ajar, but now it was fully open. And what was worse? There was someone, or something, standing in the doorway. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way Sarah understood people. The figure in the doorway was long and distorted, its limbs stretching at unnatural angles. Its face was obscured by shadows, but the shape seemed to move, swaying as though it were made of smoke or mist. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward. Her entire body went rigid. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but she couldn't. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there, frozen in place, staring at the dark shape moving toward her. And then it spoke. "Sarah." The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, cold, and full of malice. "You shouldn't have stayed." A surge of fear hit Sarah like a tidal wave. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It felt as though the very air around her had turned to stone, holding her in place, suffocating her. The figure came closer, its shape becoming more defined with every step. Finally, she broke free from the paralysis, turning and sprinting down the hall, her legs pumping as fast as they could. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. She just needed to get away. Her heart thudded in her chest, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, the sound of her footsteps mingling with the eerie whispers that followed her. She didn't stop until she reached the stairwell, her chest heaving as she leaned against the railing. For a moment, she just stood there, trying to calm herself, trying to understand what was happening. Her mind was spinning, the terror threatening to swallow her whole. And then she heard it again. The whisper. "Sarah." It was close. Too close. She turned around, but the hallway was empty, once again. The building was silent. Too silent. Sarah didn't stay to find out if the silence was the calm before the storm, or if it was the calm before something far worse. She turned and ran up the stairs, ignoring the pain in her legs, determined to get out of this nightmare before it consumed her completely. The adrenaline coursed through Sarah's veins as she sprinted up the stairs, each step more frantic than the last. Her heart hammered in her chest, the sound of it drowning out everything else. She had no idea where she was going, but anywhere was better than being stuck in that hallway, trapped by the unnerving presence that seemed to haunt every corner of the hospital. Her breath was coming in shallow gasps as her legs burned with the effort, but she couldn't stop. She didn't dare stop. The stairwell was dimly lit, the flickering overhead light adding to the sense of unease that clung to her like a second skin. Shadows danced along the walls, distorting with every step she took. The silence of the hospital had never felt so suffocating, so overwhelming. The stillness gnawed at her, each creak of the building's old bones sending fresh waves of dread through her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. As she reached the top of the stairs, she paused for a moment, trying to collect herself. She leaned against the railing, her chest heaving, eyes scanning the dark hallway in front of her. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting long, jittery shadows along the corridor. There was nothing there, no one. Yet, she couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't alone. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible presence, pressing down on her from all sides. A soft click echoed through the hallway, the sound of a door creaking open, and Sarah's breath hitched. She stiffened, her body tensing in response to the sound. The footsteps had started again, slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty space. This time, they weren't in the distance. They were close. Too close. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source, but there was nothing to see. Just the empty corridor, stretching out before her, bathed in the pale light from the overhead bulbs. She could almost feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, making it harder to breathe. The footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing second. They were right behind her. With a strangled gasp, Sarah whirled around, expecting to see someone, or something, just behind her. But the hallway was empty. No one there. She blinked, her heart pounding harder in her chest. The sound of the footsteps, though, was unmistakable. It was like they were right on top of her, as if the air itself was alive, pulsating with the rhythm of whatever was following her. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, her palms slick with fear. She could feel it, that gnawing sensation at the back of her mind, the one that told her she was being watched. She didn't know how much more she could take. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to escape, but the hallway ahead seemed endless, like it was stretching out farther the longer she stood there, frozen. A soft whisper tickled her ear. It was so quiet at first, like a breath against her skin, but it was enough to make her spine stiffen in terror. Sarah. The voice was low and guttural, too familiar to be a coincidence. It was the same voice she had heard before, back in the hallway, calling her name like a ghostly lullaby. Her blood ran cold as she whipped her head around again, but once again, there was nothing. No one. Her vision blurred, her thoughts disjointed as panic set in. Was she losing her mind? Was she just imagining things? She didn't know what was real anymore. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out any rational thought. She was alone. She had to be. There was no one here. But the whispers kept coming, low and persistent, slipping through the cracks of her sanity. She forced herself to take a step forward, even though every part of her screamed to turn around and flee. The footsteps followed her, the sound of them hauntingly close, the rhythm never faltering. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the weight of the air around her thickening with every passing moment. The hallway stretched out before her, endless and suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The change was subtle at first, just a slight chill that brushed against her skin. But within moments, it felt like the very air had turned to ice. She shivered, her breath now visible in the air as it fogged up in front of her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, a deep, primal fear crawling under her skin. It was getting colder by the second. Too cold. She reached the next door, her hand trembling as she grabbed the handle. It turned with ease, the door creaking open, and Sarah rushed inside without a second thought, desperate to escape whatever was chasing her. She slammed the door behind her and leaned against it, her body shaking uncontrollably. The room was dark, the faint glow of the emergency exit lights barely illuminating the space. She took a few shaky steps forward, trying to steady her breathing. There was something wrong with this room. It felt wrong. The walls were lined with old hospital equipment, unused and gathering dust, but there was something about the room that made her feel as though she wasn't alone. Her eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, trying to pick out anything that could explain the chill in the air, the sense of being watched. Her breath caught as she noticed a shape in the corner of the room. At first, she thought it was just another piece of forgotten equipment. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized it was something else entirely. A figure. A person. Or at least it looked like one. It was hunched over, its back facing her, but something was off about it. The way it sat, unnaturally still, was unsettling. Sarah's pulse quickened as she took a step closer. She could see the faint outline of the figure's head, twisted at an angle that defied human anatomy. Her feet seemed to move of their own accord, bringing her closer to the figure. Her mind screamed for her to stop, to turn around, to get out of the room, but she couldn't. She had to know what it was. She had to see if it was real. As she got closer, the air grew even colder, the room now a tomb of silence. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge her presence. It was as if it was waiting for her. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the figure's shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through her body. She gasped, pulling her hand back as if burned. The figure's head snapped around so quickly, it seemed to defy all logic. The face was a blur of shadow, but its eyes, they were wide, black and hollow, staring into her soul with an intensity that sent a wave of nausea through her. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the air around her vibrated with an eerie pressure, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Her vision swam, her knees weak beneath her as she staggered back, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She had to get out. She couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, the shadows growing longer, the figure looming closer with every heartbeat. She turned, scrambling for the door, but it slammed shut just as her hand reached the handle. The room felt smaller now, as though it was shrinking, the walls pushing in from all sides. Panic gripped her chest as she rattled the door, her breath coming in ragged sobs. It wouldn't budge. She was trapped. And the figure, whatever it was drawing nearer, its footsteps now audible in the silence. Sarah's hands flew to her throat, as if she could somehow choke down the rising panic, the suffocating dread that threatened to swallow her whole. The cold was unbearable now, her breath freezing in the air as she backed into a corner. She felt like she was suffocating, her lungs burning with every gasp. And then, in the deafening silence, she heard it. A voice. Soft but unmistakable. "Sarah." The whisper lingered in the air like a taunt. She whirled around, eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing. Just the empty darkness. Except for the figure, standing directly in front of her. Sarah's mind was a chaotic storm as she stumbled backward, her heart pounding so loudly she could feel it in her throat. She was no longer sure what was real or what was a figment of her increasingly fragile imagination. The figure, whatever it was, loomed in front of her, its black eyes boring into her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice lost in the fear that choked her. She had never felt so small, so utterly powerless. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to escape, but her body wouldn't obey. It felt as though the world itself had frozen, the very air thick with dread and malevolent energy. Time slowed to a crawl, and in those endless moments, the only sound was her shallow breathing, the thudding of her heart, and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of the figure's footsteps moving closer. It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. The way it moved, the way it stood there without a sound, was too wrong, too unnatural. Its shape seemed to distort, as though it were more shadow than substance, but the darkness around it clung to it like a shroud. The figure's head twitched slightly, an unsettling jerk that made Sarah's blood run cold. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, her vision blurring as though she were about to pass out. But she couldn't. She couldn't afford to lose consciousness in this nightmare. She tried to move, tried to take a step back, but her legs were frozen. Every part of her screamed to run, to break free of this nightmare, but she couldn't. The figure took another step toward her, its movements fluid but disjointed, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Each step it took seemed to stretch the distance between them, each movement more deliberate, more sinister. She could see its form more clearly now, its twisted limbs elongated and unnatural, and the sense of horror deepened. She was trapped in a room with something that wasn't human, something that wasn't bound by the same laws of nature. The air in the room was thick with the smell of decay, an overpowering stench that seemed to emanate from the figure itself. Her hands shook uncontrollably, her entire body trembling as if she had been plunged into freezing water. Her eyes flicked to the door, desperate to escape, but it was no use. The door had slammed shut the moment she turned her back, as though the hospital itself was in on the nightmare, trapping her in this room with whatever malevolent force stood before her. There was no way out. No one would come to help. She was utterly alone, trapped with this thing. She didn't know what it was. She didn't want to know. But she knew that it wasn't something she could defeat with anything as simple as her fear or her willpower. For what felt like an eternity, Sarah and the figure stood in the silence, the tension between them palpable. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Sarah could feel it, feel its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced, frantically searching for any escape, any way to break free from this nightmare. She thought of the journal she had found, the warnings of the previous nurse who had written about the strange occurrences in the hospital. But what good would it do now? The nurse had disappeared, and now Sarah was left to face whatever this thing was. There was no escape, no help, no salvation. She was utterly at its mercy. The room grew colder, if that was even possible. The temperature seemed to drop with every second, the chill biting into her skin, her breath fogging in front of her. She could feel the cold deep in her bones, a cold that seemed to seep into her very soul. It was as if the figure was draining the warmth from the room, sucking the life out of everything it touched. She wanted to scream, to break the silence, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Her mouth was dry, her tongue thick with fear, and her voice had abandoned her. And then, the figure did something that made her blood run colder than the temperature in the room. It moved its hand, slowly, deliberately, toward her. The movement was unnatural, jerky, as if it were testing her to see how far it could push her before she broke. Sarah stood frozen, unable to move, unable to do anything but watch as the figure's hand came closer. She could feel the tension building in the room, the oppressive weight of its gaze, and the terror that pulsed in the air. The closer the figure's hand got, the harder it was to breathe, as if the very air was thickening, suffocating her. The hand stopped just inches from her face, its long, bony fingers twitching slightly, like a predator toying with its prey. Sarah's body screamed for her to run, to fight, to do anything, but she was paralyzed with fear, unable to make a sound, unable to even move her feet. The figure's hand hovered there, and in that moment, she felt something that she couldn't explain. It wasn't a physical touch, but something far worse. It was as though the figure was reaching into her very soul, pulling at the deepest, darkest corners of her mind. She felt exposed, naked, as though it were stripping away the very layers of her existence, leaving her vulnerable to whatever horrors it could inflict. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter and tighter as the air grew heavier with each passing second. The figure's eyes, those hollow, black eyes, never left hers. They were empty, devoid of anything resembling humanity, yet they held a strange power over her. They seemed to pull her in, like a whirlpool dragging her down into an abyss. Sarah tried to look away, but her body refused to cooperate. It was as if she was trapped in the figure's gaze, unable to escape. Her thoughts were scattered, her mind swimming with terror and confusion, unable to focus on anything but the oppressive presence in front of her. The hand came closer, so close now that she could feel the chill of it, though it never made contact. But the sensation of it being so close was almost worse than if it had touched her. She could feel the cold emanating from it, the malevolent energy that seemed to pulse from its very fingertips. It was as though the figure was trying to reach into her, to claim her, to take something from her that she couldn't afford to lose. And then, in the silence, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, guttural, and yet it seemed to echo in her very soul, reverberating in the stillness of the room. "You shouldn't have stayed." The words sent a shock through Sarah, a shock that rattled her to her core. She had heard that voice before. It was the same voice that had whispered her name in the hallways, the same voice that had followed her through the empty hospital, the same voice that had lured her deeper into this nightmare. She had known, deep down, that this moment was inevitable. She had known that she couldn't escape. But hearing those words, those chilling, final words, sent a wave of terror so deep that it felt like it was drowning her. Her body finally gave way, her legs collapsing beneath her as the figure's words echoed in her ears. She hit the cold floor with a dull thud, her mind spinning, her body shaking uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to get away from the figure, but her body was too weak, too overwhelmed. She could feel her pulse in her throat, hear the blood rushing in her ears. The figure loomed over her, its black eyes never leaving her, its hands still hovering inches from her face. Sarah tried to crawl away, but she couldn't. The room had become a prison, the walls pressing in on her, the air thick and suffocating. The figure's presence was everywhere, its dark energy surrounding her, suffocating her. She was trapped. Sarah's body trembled violently, her hands gripping the cold, hard floor beneath her, as if trying to steady herself, to anchor herself in the suffocating reality of what was happening. She could feel the air in the room growing colder by the second, the temperature dropping so fast that she could see her breath fogging up in front of her. It was as though the very essence of the room, of the building itself, was being drained of life, leaving only an empty, oppressive space where dread lingered in every corner. Her mind was a blur, thoughts scattering like dust in the wind, struggling to find something to hold on to in the face of the unfathomable terror that surrounded her. Her gaze flickered back to the figure in front of her. The hand, it was still there, hovering just above her head, its long, bony fingers twitching as if testing the air around her. The figure had not moved, not yet, but it didn't need to. The mere presence of it was enough to paralyze her, to freeze her in place. Her instincts screamed at her to get up, to run, but her legs refused to cooperate. It was as if the terror had seeped into her very bones, rooting her to the spot, rendering her powerless. The figure's eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto hers. The longer Sarah stared into them, the more she felt herself slipping, as though the gaze was drawing her in, pulling her deeper into a darkness that was not just physical, but mental, spiritual. She could feel herself unraveling, piece by piece, as if the figure was slowly siphoning her thoughts, her emotions, everything that made her, her. There was a deep, gnawing feeling in her chest, like something vital was being taken from her, something she couldn't replace. Her breath became ragged, shallow, as she struggled to pull herself together, to fight the overwhelming sense of helplessness that threatened to drown her. She glanced around the room, desperate to find anything that could help her escape. But the walls were closing in, narrowing around her, as if the building itself was conspiring to trap her here, with the figure, in this nightmare. There was no door, no window, no escape. The room felt infinite and suffocating at the same time, as though it stretched on forever, swallowing her whole. Her throat tightened as the reality of her situation settled in. This wasn't just a bad dream. This wasn't some strange hallucination brought on by exhaustion or stress. This was real. This was happening. A sudden, sharp noise, a crack, sounded from somewhere behind her, causing her to jump in fear. She whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The room, however, remained empty. There was no one there, no movement, no sound except for her own panicked breaths and the relentless beating of her heart. But the sense of being watched had not gone away. It had intensified, a suffocating weight pressing down on her from all sides. Whatever this thing was, whatever it had been waiting for, it was now here, and there was no getting out. The walls were too tight. The air was too thick. It was closing in on her, suffocating her from every direction. And then the voice spoke again. "You're not getting out," it said, the words rolling out slowly, deliberately, each syllable dripping with an unnatural coldness. The voice was low, guttural, but it seemed to reverberate in her chest, deep within her, as if the words weren't just spoken, but were being etched into her very soul. "You should have left when you had the chance. But now it's too late." The chill in the air grew even more intense, and Sarah's body involuntarily shuddered, as if the words had caused a physical reaction. She wanted to scream, to plead, to beg for mercy, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry, constricted, and even if she could speak, she knew that it wouldn't matter. There was no mercy here. There was no one who would hear her cries. She was utterly alone. The figure's form seemed to shift slightly, as though it were a shadow warping in the dim light, its movements too fluid, too unnatural to be real. It took a slow step forward, and despite the distance between them, Sarah felt the oppressive weight of its presence pressing in on her, as if it was right there, standing inches from her face. Her pulse quickened, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps as she struggled to break free from the paralysis that had gripped her. But the more she tried, the more it felt like her body was betraying her, as though it was unwilling to help her escape the nightmare that had been thrust upon her. The figure raised its hand once again, its fingers twitching slightly, and in that moment, Sarah felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, as if something was tearing at her from the inside. She gasped, clutching at her chest, the sensation of a vice tightening around her heart making her vision blur. Was it the figure? Was it somehow doing this to her, controlling her, twisting her insides with its malevolent presence? She didn't know. She couldn't know. All she could feel was the crushing pain, the gnawing fear, and the sense that she was on the edge of something much worse than she could possibly imagine. Her vision swam, her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor with a muffled thud. The world spun around her, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she might pass out, might lose herself completely to the suffocating fear and the pain that gripped her. But somehow, she held on, clinging to her last thread of consciousness, trying to keep her mind from slipping into the darkness that seemed to beckon her. The figure stood over her, its shadow stretching long across the floor as it towered above her, blocking out the faint light. Its eyes were still locked onto hers, those hollow, soulless eyes that seemed to pierce through her very being. She could feel them, could feel the weight of them burrowing into her mind, pulling at her thoughts, pulling at the very core of her existence. She was losing herself. Piece by piece, she could feel herself unraveling, her identity slipping away like water through her fingers. She tried to speak, tried to find her voice, but no words came out. Her throat was raw, tight, constricted, as if something was choking her from the inside. The pain in her chest intensified, and her body shook uncontrollably, the cold seeping deeper into her bones. She was freezing, her teeth chattering, but it wasn't just the cold that was making her shake. It was the terror, the absolute, soul-crushing terror that had her locked in place, unable to do anything but stare up at the figure before her. The voice spoke again, its tone dripping with malevolent satisfaction. "You're mine now," it said, the words curling around her like tendrils of smoke. "You can't escape. You never could. I've been waiting for you." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she tried to process the words, tried to understand what they meant. The terror in her chest flared up again, a wave of nausea rising in her throat as the darkness in the room seemed to close in even tighter. She had been waiting? Waiting for her? For what? What was this thing? What did it want from her? Her mind raced, but it was as if everything she thought, everything she had ever known, was slipping away, vanishing into the oppressive shadows that surrounded her. The walls of the room seemed to press in even tighter, the air thicker, heavier, until it was almost impossible to breathe. She was suffocating, drowning in the dark, and the figure above her was only a part of it, an extension of the nightmare that was swallowing her whole. The figure leaned down, its face now so close to hers that she could feel its cold breath against her skin. She could smell it now, something rancid, something decayed, like the stench of death itself. And then it spoke, its voice low and mocking. "You should have left. You shouldn't have stayed. Now there's no escape." With those final words, the figure reached out, its long, cold fingers closing around her throat, and everything went black. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. Sarah could feel it pressing in on her from every direction, a heavy, cold void that seemed to swallow her whole. She couldn't breathe. It was as though her lungs had ceased to function, trapped in an endless abyss where the air was thick and unyielding. Her chest heaved, but each breath was shallow, each gasp more desperate than the last. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her voice was gone, swallowed by the crushing blackness that surrounded her. She couldn't move. She couldn't see. All she had was the overwhelming sense of being lost in an infinite, stifling void. Her mind raced in the dark, her thoughts a whirlwind of panic and confusion. Where was she? What had happened? Had she died? Was this the end? It felt like it, like the very essence of her being had been torn apart and scattered into this endless blackness. The fear that gripped her heart threatened to swallow her, but something deep within her, something primal, refused to give in. She wasn't dead. Not yet. She had to fight. She had to find a way out. But how? How could she escape when there was nothing? No light, no sound, no escape? A faint glimmer of light flickered in the distance, so far away it seemed impossible to reach, yet Sarah's heart seized with a flicker of hope. Was it real? Was it a way out of this hellish nightmare? She couldn't tell. The light was faint, almost ethereal, and it pulsed in the distance like the heartbeat of the darkness itself. It beckoned to her, drawing her in, promising escape, but how could she trust it? What if it was just another illusion, another trick of the mind? What if it led her deeper into this endless void, into a place she could never return from? But Sarah couldn't stop herself. She was moving, slowly at first, as though her body was unsure whether to obey her commands. But the light, there was something about it, something that felt like it was pulling her, like it was her only chance. The darkness around her seemed to shift, to writhe as she moved toward it, as if the very fabric of the void was alive, reacting to her presence. Every step felt heavy, as though the air itself was trying to keep her from moving forward, but Sarah pushed on, determined to reach the light, to escape this suffocating prison. The light grew brighter as she approached, its pulse growing stronger, and with it, the weight of the darkness seemed to lessen, just slightly. She could feel her body beginning to respond, her muscles loosening as she walked, her mind clearing, if only just a little. The terror that had gripped her earlier hadn't faded, not entirely, but there was something about this light that felt like salvation, like a chance to escape the nightmare that had engulfed her. It was just a glimmer, just a hint of hope, but it was enough. With every step, the light drew her closer, and soon, it was no longer just a distant flicker but a glowing presence that illuminated the void around her. It was warm, comforting, the kind of light that made her feel safe, as though it could protect her from the darkness that had nearly consumed her. She reached out, her hand trembling, and as her fingers brushed the edge of the light, she felt a sudden jolt, a surge of energy rushing through her, filling her with warmth and strength. It was overwhelming, as though the very essence of the light was pouring into her, erasing the fear and pain that had taken root inside her. But then in an instant, the warmth vanished. The light flickered, dimming to nothingness in the blink of an eye. The pulse of energy stopped, leaving Sarah standing in the dark once more. Her heart raced, panic clawing at her chest as the familiar weight of the void closed in again, more suffocating than before. She stood frozen, the hope she had felt just moments ago now crushed, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. What had happened? Where had the light gone? Was it just another cruel illusion? The darkness was back, as impenetrable as ever, and with it came the fear, rising, twisting, coiling inside her. It was as if the very fabric of her existence had been torn apart, and now she was adrift in a world that offered no comfort, no escape. She couldn't understand what was happening, couldn't understand what this place was or why she was trapped here. But the fear remained, persistent and unyielding. Then, as if from the deepest recesses of her mind, she heard a voice, a whisper, soft and cold, like the wind passing through a cracked window. "You can't leave. You're mine now." The words echoed in her mind, reverberating in the silence of the void, and Sarah's heart clenched with fear. She wasn't alone. She wasn't alone in this dark, suffocating place. The voice, it was familiar, but she couldn't place it, couldn't remember where she had heard it before. It didn't matter. The words cut through her like a knife, the icy tones sinking deep into her bones. "You can't escape," the voice continued, growing clearer, more distinct. "You should have known this would happen." The weight of the words hung heavily in the air, each one sinking deeper into her consciousness. They felt like a threat, like a promise, like the final truth she had been unwilling to face. She had been drawn here, pulled into this nightmare, and there was no way out. Not now. Not anymore. The dread that filled her chest seemed to expand, flooding every inch of her being. She couldn't escape. Not from this place. Not from whatever was controlling it, whatever was controlling her. The voice laughed, a low, menacing sound that sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just a laugh. It was a sound of knowing, of certainty, as though it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to realize the truth. And in that moment, Sarah understood. The figure, the thing that had haunted her in the hospital, the thing that had watched her every step, it wasn't just a part of this nightmare. It was the nightmare. It was the force that controlled this place, this void, and it was now in control of her. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her and pulling her deeper into the abyss. There was no escape. There was no way out. She was lost, trapped in this nightmare, forever at the mercy of the figure and whatever dark force it represented. It had been waiting for her, had drawn her here, and now it had claimed her. She was its prisoner, its plaything. There was nothing she could do. Her thoughts spiraled as the darkness closed in once again, the weight of the void pressing on her from all sides. She tried to fight it, tried to resist, but it was useless. The fear had become too strong, too overwhelming, and the reality of her situation settled in like a heavy weight that she could never escape. She was nothing more than a pawn in this endless nightmare, and there was no escape. There was no light, no hope. Only the darkness. The voice returned, more insistent this time, its words sharp and taunting. "You thought you could escape? You thought you could leave? Now, you belong to me." Her heart sank, and a wave of despair flooded over her. It was true. She had thought she could escape. She had thought she could outrun the fear, the darkness. But now she realized the truth. She was trapped. Forever. And as the darkness closed in, she felt her mind slipping, her consciousness fading, until there was nothing left but the cold, unrelenting void. Sarah's mind was foggy, like a thick, impenetrable mist had settled over her thoughts. making it difficult to discern reality from nightmare. Her body ached, her muscles sore and stiff from the terrifying experience that seemed to stretch on forever, and yet, somehow, she was still alive. Still aware. Still caught in this nightmare that seemed to blur the lines between the real and the imagined. She had no idea how much time had passed since the darkness had first swallowed her whole, but it didn't matter. Time had lost all meaning. Every second felt like an eternity. The weight of the void around her seemed to press down even harder now, suffocating her with its oppressive silence. It was as if the darkness had a life of its own, a presence that surrounded her, trapping her in a place with no escape. The stillness was unbearable, a thick, suffocating quiet that made her feel even more isolated, more helpless. She couldn't even hear her own breath, couldn't feel the steady rhythm of her heart anymore. It was as though the very essence of her existence had been stripped away, leaving nothing but an empty shell, drifting in an endless sea of nothingness. But then, just as the despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt it. A flicker. A slight shift in the air around her, like the faintest ripple on the surface of a still pond. It was almost imperceptible at first, but Sarah's instincts, those same instincts that had kept her alive up until now, snapped to attention. Something had changed. Something was different. The air around her seemed to hum, a faint vibration that resonated deep in her chest. Her heart fluttered, the sensation of something, or someone, moving in the darkness. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, a surge of adrenaline flooding her system as her senses heightened. There was movement, subtle but undeniable. She wasn't alone anymore. Sarah tried to focus, to clear the fog in her mind and make sense of what was happening. She strained to listen, her ears ringing with silence, but she could hear it now, the faint sound of something dragging, slowly, methodically across the floor. A soft scraping noise, like nails on metal. It was distant at first, but it grew closer, growing louder with each passing second. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the sound for what it was. Something or someone was coming toward her. She tried to move, tried to get to her feet, but her body wouldn't respond. It felt like she was wading through thick mud, every attempt to move weighed down by an invisible force, as though the darkness itself were trying to hold her in place. Panic surged, and she fought against it, pushing with every ounce of her will to break free of the paralysis that gripped her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air around her biting into her skin as the dragging sound grew louder, closer. She had to move. She had to get away. The sound stopped suddenly, dead in its tracks, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Silence enveloped her again, thick and heavy, but this time it wasn't comforting. It was worse. The stillness seemed to stretch on, drawing out the tension, the anticipation of whatever was lurking just beyond her reach. She could feel it now, the presence that hovered just out of sight, just beyond the edge of her perception. It was there, watching her, waiting. And then she heard it. The whisper. It was barely audible, a breathy rasp that seemed to come from every direction at once. Sarah. The voice was low, almost tender, but there was a coldness to it that made her skin crawl. It was a voice she knew, a voice that had haunted her throughout this nightmare, a voice that had spoken to her in the hallway, in the room with the figure, and now, here, in the suffocating dark. The voice of the thing that had been waiting for her. The thing that had trapped her in this place. The whisper curled around her like a snake, slithering through the air, wrapping around her mind, and pulling her deeper into its grasp. "You can't escape me," it continued, the words slipping into her thoughts like poison. "I've been waiting for you to understand." She could feel her mind cracking under the weight of it, the pressure building in her chest, the sense of being suffocated both physically and mentally. She wasn't just trapped in the darkness. She was trapped in her own mind, drowning in the fear and the knowledge that there was no escape. No way out. The figure, the thing that had been waiting for her, it was here, in this place, and it would never let her go. The darkness seemed to thicken around her, the air growing colder, denser. She could feel it now, the oppressive weight of whatever was lurking in the shadows. It wasn't just a presence. It was a force. It was the thing that had brought her here, the thing that had twisted everything, warped her reality until it was nothing but a maze of nightmares and endless terror. The whisper returned, louder this time, and Sarah's thoughts faltered, as if the voice itself were ripping through her consciousness. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah," it rasped, its tone mocking cruel. "You should have stayed away." But now, the voice trailed off, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever, suffocating her even further. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, distant at first, but growing closer. The slow, deliberate pacing of something moving in the dark, coming for her, dragging its feet like a predator closing in on its prey. She could feel it now, the weight of its presence. Tigger was coming closer, and she was helpless to stop it. Her body, her mind were trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was dry, her body too weak to move. The darkness had consumed her, and now it was closing in, tightening around her like a vice. She was lost. Lost in this endless void, with nothing to anchor her, nothing to hold on to. The footsteps stopped. Everything went still, as though the world had frozen in place. The air grew colder, and she felt a sharp prickling at the back of her neck, like someone was standing right behind her, just out of sight. She could feel the breath on her skin, the weight of the figure's presence pressing in on her, and yet, when she turned, there was nothing. Only darkness. "Don't look," the voice whispered again, the words curling into her mind like tendrils. "Don't look, or you'll never be able to leave." Her heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the voice's warning echoed in her mind. She couldn't look. She couldn't give in to the temptation to turn around, to see what was behind her. If she did, if she let her curiosity take control, she knew she would never escape. It would be the end. The figure would claim her, and she would be lost forever, trapped in this never-ending nightmare. But as the seconds dragged on, Sarah felt herself losing control. The pull was too strong, the desire to know, to understand, overpowering everything else. She had to look. She had to know. She had to see what was behind her, what had been waiting in the shadows. And with a final, desperate breath, Sarah turned. The moment Sarah turned, her heart seemed to stop, and time itself appeared to bend, stretching into a painful eternity. For a split second, everything around her was still. The darkness that enveloped her, once thick and oppressive, now felt as though it had opened up, revealing the most terrifying truth. She couldn't explain it, couldn't fathom what she was seeing. But her senses screamed at her, "This is wrong." What lay in front of her wasn't just a shadow, a trick of the mind. It wasn't just the figure that had been stalking her. It was something far worse, something more insidious, something that knew her. The thing, no, the creature, was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs elongated and twisted at odd angles that defied the laws of nature. The way it moved was unsettling. It didn't walk, it drifted, its feet never seeming to touch the ground, like it was hovering just above the floor. Its body was a mass of shifting shadows, constantly shifting in and out of existence, flickering between solid form and something more like smoke. But its face, or what passed for a face, was what made Sarah's stomach turn. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, but a smooth, featureless expanse of gray skin that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. And yet, in that featureless void, Sarah felt the weight of something staring back at her. An intelligence, a malevolent awareness, that pierced through her very soul. She tried to look away, but her body refused to listen. Her eyes were locked on it, frozen in place by the sheer, paralyzing fear that gripped her chest. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air around it grew thick, dense with a kind of heaviness that pressed down on her, suffocating her. It wasn't just a presence, it was an absolute force, something that bent reality itself. Sarah's mind felt like it was being pulled apart by its very gaze, its intention clear, though it had never uttered a word. This thing had been waiting for her. No, it had chosen her, and the realization struck Sarah like a physical blow. She wanted to scream, to break the silence that had become suffocating in its weight, but the scream died before it could form. It was as if her very vocal cords were being torn away, muted by the presence of the creature before her. Her body felt like a hollow shell, her mind racing but unable to form any coherent thoughts. What had she been hoping for? That this thing would be some kind of mistake? Some part of a nightmare that she could wake up from? This was no mistake. This was no dream. The creature made no move to approach her. Instead, it simply stood there, watching her with its unseen, all-knowing eyes. The silence grew deeper, denser, each passing second stretching into an eternity. The stillness was almost more maddening than the terror, for it was the absence of sound, of movement, that made the fear fester and grow. Sarah could feel her breath shallow, her chest tightening with every passing second as the weight of the creature's presence pressed in on her. She knew that any attempt to move, to escape, would be futile. Her legs were as heavy as stone, her body paralyzed in place by the sheer force of this unearthly terror. The silence was broken by a faint sound, a whisper that seemed to come from all around her. It wasn't a voice, exactly, it was more like a thought invading her mind, a presence making itself known through the very fabric of her consciousness. "You knew this would happen," the whisper said, its tone soft, cold, and ancient. The words were not spoken with malice but with something far more unsettling, detachment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't joy. It was simply the voice of inevitability, of something far older and more powerful than anything Sarah could comprehend. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel a wave of nausea rising within her. She fought to keep her thoughts from scattering, tried to make sense of the words, but they were like sharp knives cutting through her mind, disorienting her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. "You shouldn't have come," the whisper continued, growing stronger now. "You were meant to stay away. But now you belong to me." The words felt like they were carving themselves into her very soul, each syllable embedding itself in the core of her being. "Belong to me." The words echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain, and Sarah could feel herself slipping, the very foundations of her reality starting to crack. She had thought she was just unlucky. She had thought that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to escape, a way out of this madness. But now, as the whisper grew louder, as the figure before her remained motionless, Sarah realized the horrifying truth. She wasn't unlucky. She was chosen. This wasn't random. It was never random. She tried to scream, tried to break free of the invisible chains that held her in place, but the scream was swallowed before it could escape her lips. Instead, her mind flashed with images, fragments of memories she couldn't place, faces she couldn't recognize, a deep sense of déjà vu that made her stomach churn. The more she tried to focus, the more the images slipped away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. What was this thing? What did it want from her? The creature's figure began to shift, the shadows writhing around it like liquid, a dark vortex that threatened to swallow everything in its path. It was moving now, slowly, but with an inevitability that sent a spike of pure terror through Sarah's veins. The air seemed to crackle, an almost electric charge filling the room, and the temperature plummeted, so cold that she could see her breath in the air, thick and heavy with condensation. She couldn't tell if it was the creature's doing or something else, but the cold was unbearable, seeping into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. It came closer, not with haste, but with an inexorable slowness that seemed to stretch time, pulling each second out longer than the last. The more it moved, the more Sarah could feel her body weakening, her strength draining as if the very essence of her life was being siphoned away. The closer it came, the harder it became to breathe, the colder the air felt, the tighter the suffocating grip of fear became. She wanted to fight, wanted to break free, but she could feel her body refusing her limbs too heavy to move, her mind too clouded to think clearly. She was trapped. The creature stopped a mere few feet away from her, its presence suffocating, oppressive, filling the entire room with a sense of impending doom. The darkness around them seemed to swirl, its edges bleeding into the very fabric of reality, threatening to erase everything that wasn't part of it. Sarah's mind was reeling, her thoughts spinning, and all she could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the figure before her loomed over her, its shapeless form blotting out everything else in the room. And then it spoke again, but this time, the words were different. They were not whispered into her mind, but spoken aloud, a low, guttural rasp that sounded like 1,000 voices blending together into one. "You will never leave," it said, each word soaked in ancient sorrow. "You were never meant to. Your soul is mine, Sarah. Forever."